I need to leave some time for Mr. Kattan to speak, so I'll only touch the highlights of his background and education. He graduated from University of Montreal in political philosophy. If your mind can get around that, and then did a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, and then a second BA in economics and politics, and he was making a career out of being a student. And then was a speechwriter for Dom McKinnon, who was with the Commonwealth Fund, and now is director of communications, or communications advisor for the Alliance on the AOC. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ralph, and thank you to you all. It's a great privilege and a great pleasure for me to be here with you tonight. Very glad to be up here in Vermont. Just to tell you a bit more about myself, I've been in the U.S. for a couple of years, working at the UN, and previously working in London. So it's really great for me to discover another part of America. I'm going to talk to you today about a young organization within the UN system, which is called the Alliance of Civilizations. And I've brought some reports which I will talk about. It's very, very important and a great opportunity for me to be here to represent the Alliance of Civilizations. First of all, because we enjoy and look for opportunities to talk about the work that we're doing in a number of different circles. And second of all, because it's very important, being a young organization that is still shaping its future, if you like, very important for us to have input from people who are interested and experts in foreign relations. And that's why I would really like this to be an interactive session as much as possible. I'm going to keep my remarks quite short to allow you to ask questions, and I'd be really very interested and curious about your views about the work that we do and the sorts of challenges that we all face. I thought it would be interesting to give you a bit of background about the Alliance of Civilizations and how it came about. It was created 2 years ago in the wake of the Madrid bombings, and the Prime Minister of Spain at the time, who's still Prime Minister Zapatero, saw that there was a great need to reconcile peoples and nations and communities, and particularly saw that there was a very great need to build bridges between Islam, the Muslim world, and the West. He put the idea of an alliance of civilizations, an organization to be set up within the UN, to the then Secretary General Kofi Annan. And Kofi Annan told him, yeah, great idea, why don't you link up with another country, with a Muslim country, this way you would have a bridge that illustrates exactly the kind of thing that you want to do. So he went to see Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey, and he saw this as a great opportunity as well for him. And that's how the Alliance of Civilizations was born. They then developed a high-level, what they call a high-level group, which is basically a group of experts. This is the UN jargon. But they're basically a group of people who come from all walks of life, international personalities, who have an area, who have an expertise and something to say about basically relations between communities. former presidents and prime ministers, but also academics. John Esposito, some of you might have heard of, who teaches here in the US in Washington. Karen Armstrong, who is a specialist of world religions from the UK. And then you had also some strange bedfellows. The advisor to the Moroccan king, André Azoulay, who happens to be Jewish, with Sheikh Moza, the First Lady of Qatar, the former president of Iran, Mohammad Khatami, alongside Rabbi Schneier of New York. So it was a very diverse group of people, and you can just imagine the kind of discussions that they would have had, talking about the reasons why the world is in the state it is today, and why there is a rise of extremism that we are confronted with in most parts of the world. They met 4 times during 2006, and I have to be very frank with you, the discussions were sometimes very tense. The main issue they faced was really to come up with a joint message that all could subscribe to, and that all their constituencies could actually subscribe to without actually, throw them away. And so for the first few months, they really focused on a number of very concrete issues. So you're faced with rise of extremism, rise of fundamentalist religious movements. In Islam, in the Muslim world, obviously, but also in other parts of the world. Sri Lanka is an example of a country where you do have, extremists fighting each other, but no Muslims there. So it was really a very global approach that they tried to develop, and looking at ways, very concrete ways in which they could try and address the problem. So they really focused on issues such as education, youth, what kinds of challenges are young people facing in Muslim countries, amongst immigrant populations in Europe, in the US, that make them more susceptible to adhere to extremist views and join extremist, fundamentalist, and sometimes terrorist groups. Very, very concrete proposals, looking at ways of expanding student exchange programs, looking at ways of encouraging and developing youth employment in countries in the Gulf, etc. Looking at building cultural bridges through the arts, through music and literature, etc. And they all broadly agreed on, what could be done at that level. But once everything was said and done, they still hadn't touched on the main issues, which in their eyes were the political issues, the political situation that many Muslim countries are facing today, and which do and did in their minds have an impact on the rise of extremism and growing polarization between East and West. And so they felt that the report really had to make a strong political statement, and that's where things became very tricky, because some would emphasize, well, listen, okay, well, we're looking at, growing group of people who are brainwashed into becoming human bombs. How does that happen? How does that occur? Well, some would say there are internal problems in many Muslim societies, and they look at, for example, one of the UN reports that has had a lot of impact, the Arab Human Development Report, which looks at 3 issues that explain the lack of progress in many Muslim societies, including lack of political freedom, lack of gender equality. You've got basically half the population in some countries that has no implication and no right to play its full role and its full part in societies. And the third one is education and lack of education opportunities. So some of them were arguing, well, listen, we need to really focus on these issues and try and help out Muslim societies to really come up to a level of development that will create the opportunities for young people, that will divert them from other options that they're currently, or some of them, a minority of them, are currently turning to. Others were saying, well, listen, I mean, this is all very true, but you've got to look at what political issues and particularly Western foreign policy, to use a very generous euphemism, is doing to the mentalities and the way that the opinions of people in the Muslim world and elsewhere in the developing world are being shaped. You've got to look at the issue of double standards. It's true that it's a very good thing to promote democracy and human rights everywhere in the world, in the developing world in general. But at the same time, if you're doing that on the one hand, and on the other you're supporting dictatorships and military regimes, what kind of credibility do you have? Isn't it obvious that a lot of people will think that, this is kind of hypocritical? They were also making the point, well, there is the case that needs to be made that military interventions in Muslim countries is causing a lot of resentment. Now, whether that is justified or not is maybe an open issue, but the fact of the matter is it is breeding a lot of anger, and it is making the job of those who want to recruit human bombs and people who are ready to commit suicide for their cause. It makes their jobs very, very easy, or much easier. So they were debating all these issues and trying to come really to a consensus. What are we going to say that is actually going to make a difference? You've had political analyses and peace processes, etc. Galore. How are we going to make a point that is going to make the world stand up and listen? So quite an ambitious goal there. And one of the issues that they decided to focus on, and they were criticized for that, but they were conscious that they were going to get criticized on that, is to focus on the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, recognizing that, initially maybe, in the 1960s, it wasn't necessarily the cause of resentment that it has become today, recognizing that the issue has been exploited, politicized, instrumentalized, whatever you want to call it. The fact of the matter is it has become an issue that has been used and is causing a great deal of resentment, and is basically splitting opinions between, again, to categorize things very, very broadly, between the West and the Muslim world. And two members decided to put forward a proposal to the other, because basically, I mean, they were stuck. They couldn't come to a consensus. What are we going to say? What is going to be our political message? And they said, listen, there's a lot of aggravation, and misunderstanding between the Palestinian and the Israeli peoples. Obviously, there have been a lot of political documents, political processes since Oslo, the Saudi Arabia proposal, etc. We're not going to go down that route. What we're going to do is something slightly closer to the hearts and minds of people, basically. And what we propose is a white paper that would be written by one prominent Palestinian, one prominent Israeli, put them in a room together, and they write the narrative of the last 50 years, each from their own people's and their own side's point of view. And they basically do, the two parallel narratives, how these two narratives do sometimes merge and converge, and sometimes, and more often, diverge and conflict. And that would be one way in which we could basically put forward the message to the Palestinian people. There is an understanding at very high level of what has actually happened to your people and what you have suffered, and put the same message out also to the Israeli people. Now that was very ambitious, and the idea behind this, I should have said this from the outset, sorry, the two members who put forward this idea was Hubert Védrine, the former French foreign minister, and André Azoulay, who is the one of the chief advisors to the Moroccan king. Basically it's a very ambitious proposal that at the moment is still being considered. But that was their message, and when you read in the report, that is one of the main the main political proposals that the report contains. One of the main conclusions, and that's basically that's one of the things that I like to discuss and try and get also your views about tonight. One of the main conclusions of the report was you're looking at polarization between peoples generally, Islam and the West. What are the root causes for that? And the conclusion is, yes, I mean, there are religious factors. Yes, there are cultural and ethnic and national factors. But the root cause really is political. It is mainly a political issue, not a religious one. And that was their way of saying, to all those who believe that there's a clash of civilizations, that's not the right way of diagnosing the problems. It's not about incompatible religions or incompatible cultures. It's about incompatible policies and basically, the right or the wrong way of going about bringing peace to the world. There are 2 points that I'd like to raise about these conclusions, and I'd be curious to have your opinions about that. One is that there is today increasingly a tendency to perceive religion as religion in general. I'm not just talking about Islam or one religion in particular. To view religion as a very nefarious force. That's probably more the case in Europe, but there have been a number of books published in recent weeks, if not months, that I'm thinking about, but they're just 2 examples. Christopher Hitchens, in his book God is Not Great, and another one, the British scientist Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion a year or a couple of years ago. And there is this sense that if you look at the causes for conflicts in the world, many people tend to think that, and again I must stress that I think it's probably more valid in Europe than it is here, but many people tend to think that one of the main causes for conflict goes down to religion, I personally beg to disagree, and I think that that's one of the points that the report makes, that the truth is that religious ideals and principles are often exploited to justify hatred and animosity and violence. And in a world that often seems rudderless, when people feel that they lack a moral compass, many are very susceptible to be taken over by messages of hostility and violence that take root or try to be rooted in religious texts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that religion itself is at fault. To promote the idea that religion is one of the principal sources of harm and violence in the world, I think is really unfair. Religion might be a factor that is utilized, used, and abused in order to justify hostility against other people. It doesn't necessarily make it the cause or the trigger that will launch people into violence. And I think it's distinction that is very important to make. It's important because by putting the blame exclusively on religion, what ends up happening is that you are diverting from the real reasons that might have caused the conflict in the first place, and diverting attention from issues such as economic injustice, political and territorial ambitions, geopolitical rivalries between countries. There's a whole set of reasons that can trigger a conflict, both internally within a country or between countries, that are much more complex than simply the beliefs, the different beliefs that people subscribe to. And I think even more perversely, I won't go into any detail on that point, but I think even more perversely, by blaming religion, what ends up happening is that you overlook the significant contribution that many religious leaders can make in bringing about peace and in building bridges between communities. There's several examples of how that has happened in South America, even in countries where conflict is still raging, like Sudan, but also in South Africa and in Sri Lanka, the Congo. Religious communities are playing a very, very active role at grassroots level, bringing people together and helping to find common ground and a common language, whereby warring parties can actually negotiate their differences. And also in the post-conflict resolution phase and the reconciliation phase, there are very well-known examples of how religious communities have played a very important role. The second point that I'd like to make is regarding the fact that if you're saying that political issues are really one of the main causes for the increased polarization, if we are focusing on political issues, theoretically at least, it means that they can be resolved politically, and that through political negotiation and rational haggling, you can come to an agreement. If there was indeed a clash of civilizations, and if cultures were somehow doomed to violent confrontation, then there would be very little point in trying to reconcile them. If there's structural incompatibility between these worlds of belief, then one would see very little reason for trying to bridge the gap between them. But the idea of a clash of civilizations, I think, is wrong, not only because it presupposes that there are deep-rooted differences, which there are, but it presupposes that these differences are irreconcilable. And I think that is a very dangerous position to have. The encouraging point about the conclusion reached in the report is that, on the contrary, if you believe that the issues that are at stake are mainly political, then that means that there could be a political solution to solve them. Now, of course, it will necessitate a lot of work and time and energy, but at least the solution is there and it's possible. I would like now to talk to you a little bit about how the report was received, and then go into the work that the Alliance is now doing. The report was submitted to the UN Secretary General with these recommendations and these ideas in November 2006. And it was mainly, very well received, I think, in most parts of the world. I think that the focus on the Middle East conflict was seen as being problematic, probably overly ambitious by some, and there are political groups and think tanks that found these conclusions to be, a bit naive. But generally, it was well received, and the media, particularly in Europe, but also in this country, did focus on the issue very strongly. And the Secretary General thereafter appointed Jorge Sampaio, who is the former president of Portugal, to lead the organization into its new phase. So we are now a secretariat which is staffing up to probably no more than about 8 to 10 people, taking the main recommendations that are in the report and starting with the implementation phase, so putting them into action basically. We're not going to be a major funding agency. What we're going to do is basically be a go-between among civil society groups, foundations, other international organizations that work to promote increased and better cross-cultural understanding and support their programs, their projects, develop their partnerships. One of the ideas that we've had is the development of a clearinghouse. That is a repository of information about a number of themes that touch upon improving and developing cross-cultural relations. So media literacy programs, for example, journalist training. One of the ways in which you can increase understanding among Muslim and Western peoples is through the media. And taking groups of journalists from the US and Europe and provide them with training in the Muslim world, take them to the Middle East, and do the reverse, because there is a great need in the developing world, in Arab countries, to be exposed also to the ways in which journalists do their job in the US and other parts of the world. The other thing that we are planning to do is to develop a rapid response media mechanism, and that again is looking at the ways in which some issues, such as the Danish cartoons crisis, can really provide a kind of lightning rod to even increase the gap of understanding between peoples, and look at ways in which we can help prevent that. When the Pope makes remarks, for example, about Islam, this has triggered, violent demonstrations in some cases in Turkey and other countries. When you've got an issue about the wearing of the veil that comes up in France, again, possibly, violent demonstrations do occur. So the way that we want to help in these matters is to provide voices that can be voices of basically rallying support for moderate views among political leaders, among journalists, academics, artists, people from all walks of life. We're basically building a database of personalities and then helping them work their way through the media and having their voices heard through op-eds, television, radio interviews, so that they can help articulate the issue in ways that are less polarizing, and not necessarily, completely airy-fairy appeals to peace and understanding, but really try to provide some understanding of the real issues that are at stake and develop a better understanding of both of the claims that are on both sides. Other projects that we're working on are an Alliance of Civilizations Media Fund. Basically, we're working with a number of philanthropists and foundations to develop a fund that would encourage productions, cinema and mainstream productions that portray minorities in a more favorable light than they often are. We're supporting a Middle East regional youth employment center through the Qatar Foundation, basically helping young people in the region, starting with Doha and Qatar, but also broadening it to the whole of the region, providing them with the tools they need to find a job, writing up a CV, interviewing, finding networks to basically sell their wares and find work opportunities. these projects and a number of other projects we're working on, we will be focusing at a forum, an Alliance of Civilizations forum we're organizing in Madrid in January 2008, and this will bring together the main partners and stakeholders of the Alliance of Civilizations to basically do two things. One is to foster the partnerships between these groups, and two is to find funding agencies and foundations that can provide the help they need in order to develop their projects and expand them worldwide, much on the same model as the Clinton Initiative. And I'd like to finish maybe on a few words about the work of the High Representative himself, George Sampaio, and how he will be staking out his claim at trying to solve some of the issues that we're facing. One of the roles that he will play will be an advising role, working behind the scene among member governments, but also with religious leaders, trying to use his convening power to focus on a number of issues that they are facing and that they can solve together. One issue that is facing the Muslim world at the moment is the issue of humanitarian aid. And a lot of Muslim charities following 9/11 are facing a situation where they basically have all their assets frozen and cannot deliver the help that they want to deliver. For example, when there's an earthquake in Turkey or in other parts of the world, they simply cannot do it anymore because their funds are frozen. And in most cases, these organizations are bona fide organizations that have no links at all with terrorist organizations. So, bringing together the main players at policy level, both here and in Muslim countries, to try and work our way through solutions to that problem. That is one of the main roles that the High Representative could play in his capacity. Just a few concluding remarks about the place that the Alliance of Civilizations occupies within the UN architecture. You're probably familiar with the fact that the UN is in a period of transition, and there have been several reforms and restructuring of the UN in the past few months. The peacekeeping operations are being restructured. The political department is being restructured. Where do we fit as the Alliance of Civilizations in this new constellation? Our role is very modest, but I think it can be quite significant. And what it does, it exemplifies the idea that in order to deal effectively with modern conflicts, sure, boots on the ground are important, but they're not enough. And you need peacekeeping operations. You need to have involvement of the military in some cases. But what is also very crucial is to win the hearts and minds of people and to act at the level of not simply the grassroots, but at the level of opinion, where opinions are formed. How do people start developing the ways in which they perceive the other, and how do they come to a point where they perceive the other as an enemy? And you can do all you want to apprehend terrorist suspects, and all of these measures are necessary: surveillance, financial controls, etc. But it doesn't affect the overall issues that underpin the rise of extremist ideologies. Deep down, we are faced with not so much a war of religion, but we are faced with a conflict of ideologies. And I think that this is where we need to think very, very clearly about a common strategy to help address this problem. And what we advocate in addressing the growing polarization between nations is a twin-track approach, effective measures to deal with conflicts on the ground, but also grassroots efforts to bridge the gap between communities and rebuild trust between people of different religions, different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Thank you very much.